So, I mean, that's the importance of Olivier in the history of Shakespearean production, his having been done in 1947 in that classic version. So, Olivier was very taken with that Freudian interpretation, and so much of what he does in his production is to try to bring to life that Freudian interpretation. So, and I touched on that a little bit in our last class, in which I talked about how he has the scenes between Hamlet and Gertrude played in such a way that they are unmistakably erotic. I'm not saying that they're explicitly sexual, but I'm saying that they are unmistakably erotic and erotically charged. So it's also interesting that the woman whom he cast in the role of Gertrude was actually 27 years old when she played that role. Now, Gertrude would have to be a good deal older than that, wouldn't she? I mean, Gertrude would have to be in her late 40s or early 50s, right? And by the way, Olivier himself, Olivier's own real age at that time was 40. So that's very interesting. Here's a 40-year-old man who's playing a younger man. We're going to get to that question in just a moment. And he has a younger woman, a woman who's a good deal younger than he, 13 years younger than he, playing his mother. Well, what's going on there? Well, as some critics have pointed out, that opens the way for a certain eroticizing of the relationship between the two of them in interesting ways. How old is Hamlet? But often people think of Hamlet as very young. But what does the actual evidence of the play suggest? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
Wittenberg, I thought, was a school.
Okay, are you pressing the button? Well, you don't have a button on yours. Okay. Okay, so yeah, Wittenberg is actually a university. And he's been off at the university, right? Okay, so he can't be a kid, if he's a university student. What else do we know? What else do we know that might bear on this? In Act 5, Scene 1, the graveyard scene. Remember the graveyard scene? Ophelia now has died. And Hamlet comes upon the funeral that's taking place for Ophelia in the graveyard. But before the funeral procession gets there, he's been talking to the gravedigger. And the gravedigger digs up a skull, sticking away in the grave, And by the way, in the olden days, and in some places this is still done, you might be, when the person died, the person might be buried in a particular grave, but that grave might be reused for somebody else later on. And so the gravedigger is digging away, and he digs up a skull, and he hands it to Hamlet. And Hamlet says, well, who's this? Who's this? And so he says, oh, that's the old court jester. And Hamlet looks at him and he says, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio. Yorick being the name of the guy whose skull has just been dug up. And I can remember, playing with him when I was a little boy. Okay? How long has Yorick been dead? It's been dead some 25 years. Okay? And if Hamlet remembers playing with him, I mean, he can't have been at that time, just 1 or 2 years old. I mean, how many people remember things from when they're 1 or 2 years old, when they're adults? Yeah. And so what I'm getting at is you just do the arithmetic. And Hamlet has to be, as you pointed out earlier, he has to be probably around 30, give or take a year, maybe. So he's not a kid. He's clearly, you know, a mature man. And then you say, well, you know, why is he still hanging around the university? Why not? University education at this time was not as formalized and structured as it is now. It was much more a matter of attending lectures, meeting with other people, fellow students as well as faculty members, informally or in tutorials. And so it was a much more informal kind of process. And people could do it almost at any age, though it's true that the majority were younger rather than older. Okay, so in any event, that gives us some sense of our bearings here. So then that means that, you know, how old is Gertrude? Well, you know, I mean, she has to have been old enough to have had a baby, you know, 30 years earlier, let's say. You know, so she can't have been a child. And, you know, I mean, even if you say that she was a young mother, what, 15, 16, that would still put her in her middle 40s, and very likely older than that, which would put her around 50 or thereabouts, okay? So she's certainly not an old woman by any means. So it's interesting to see how she is played, how the character of Gertrude is played in different productions. And what you will see often is actresses who are known for their attractiveness will be cast in the role of Gertrude. And if you look at different versions, that certainly has proved to be the case. You want her to be an attractive woman, right? For all sorts of reasons, not because of an Oedipus complex on Hamlet's part necessarily, but because it is very clear that one of the themes in the play is sexuality, and the sexuality and all the sexual energy that exists between her and Claudius, for example, her and her husband. Okay, so notice that what we've been exploring here are certain kinds of questions. Certain kinds of questions. And some of the questions that, that certainly the Romantics were interested in the 19th century and then on into more recent times have been issues like, what about the delay? What about the famous problem of the delay? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? The famous problem of the delay? Hamlet constantly is chiding himself for delaying to achieve his vengeance on Claudius, the killer of his father, Hamlet's father, Hamlet Sr., right? So that in Act 1, Hamlet finds out that Claudius has actually killed his father, right? How does he find that out? Through his father's ghost, right? His father's ghost appears to him and says, you know, look, here's how it all happened. You know, I was taking a nap out in the garden, and he came along and he poured some poison into my ear. And fairly quickly, the poison did its work, you know, and I died. And the notion usually is that the ghost now is in purgatory. Remember we talked about purgatory here before? Is that the ghost is actually in purgatory. He's not been condemned to hell, but he had lived a life which was sufficiently spotty that he has to go to purgatory for a time being. And that seems to be pretty clear from the lines that he speaks in the play. And he there has to purge away his sins. But it was believed that God could allow a spirit to come back from the dead to inform the living of something that the living really, really, really needed to know. Now, what does the ghost tell him? The ghost tells him to exact revenge, right? Now, Hamlet knows. He says, oh, my prophetic soul. All along, I knew that something was wrong. Something was wrong. Okay? But I didn't know quite what it was. Now I know, as a result of the ghost. But what does he do about it? Does he sweep to his revenge? Absolutely not. And in a number of the soliloquies, he's chiding himself, he's lashing himself for his inaction. Why isn't he taking decisive action and go after Claudius, kill Claudius? I mean, you know, killing the king is a huge deal, and it would be taking on a huge responsibility. But apparently, he could have proved his case to the satisfaction of the others around him in the court. So why doesn't he? He keeps saying to himself, you know, over and over and over and over and over again, oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I, you know, et cetera, et cetera. The famous to be or not to be speech, you know, in which he's even considering committing suicide. He's so depressed, not simply over what has happened, but over his own inability to act. Right? So there's the famous question of the delay. Why does Hamlet keep delaying and delaying and delaying and delaying until it's too late? And by the time he actually tries to take decisive action, he's already fatally wounded himself. That's in Act 5, Scene 2. So, what are we dealing with here? The famous problem of the delay. What would argue against that? Because there are some literary critics who have said, Hamlet doesn't really delay. Where have people come up with this notion of Hamlet and the problem of the delay? What would the counter-argument be? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
I got the impression that it was more like he wanted to make sure, like that he wasn't completely sure that the ghost was, you know, a heavenly apparition or something that was being truthful with him, because of the whole deal with the play, with the actors, wanting to see Claudius's reaction. That's kind of the way I took it.
Okay, okay. Or if not a heavenly apparition, far worse, a demonic or diabolical apparition, because it was believed at that time that the devil had the power to assume different shapes in order to tempt people to commit sin. Let's see, did you also have your hand on the button there?
Well, I was going to say partly that, but partly he's obviously very disturbed about what has happened, you know what I mean? It shakes him up. He's not really sure. You know, half of him is a little crazy, half of him is a little sane, and that's kind of the whole play right there, is him wading through his madness to figure out what he's going to do about it.
Okay, okay. Now that raises another question we're going to have to come back to, which is he really mad or not? I mean, mad being the Renaissance word. That's the word, of course, that's used in the play. Is he really or is he not? And we'll have to look at that in more detail. Yeah.
Did he want
Do you have a...
his mom? I don't have
Oh, you don't have one? Oh, okay.
Did he want to protect his mom from moral pain?
That's an interesting question, too. That's a very interesting point, because look at the pain that would have caused her. That's true. I don't know if that got out on the soundtrack, so let me just repeat your question, which was, as I understand it, that he may very well not have wanted to cause more pain to his mother, and that would be good enough reason for him to hesitate to kill, after all, her brand new husband, right? Whom she seems to be hanging on. I mean, she seems really to be in love with him and very attracted to him. You know, and what if all of a sudden her son came in and butchered her husband, her new husband? Well, you know, wouldn't that be a pickle, as the old saying goes? You know, what are we dealing with here in terms of a delay? Well, let's go back to this question of the ghost. If it was believed at the time that the devil could assume a shape like this to try to tempt people to commit some terrible sin, well, you know, how do you know how reliable this ghost is? What if somebody came into the room right now? I mean, surely nobody would come late to class, but let's just assume that somebody comes into the room right now and is very, very distraught, and interrupts the class and says, I had a dream. Well, I don't know if it was a dream or not, but a ghost appeared in my bedroom last night and told me to assassinate the President of the United States. Well, presumably, you know, what we would do is we would try to hold that person down, you know, until the proper authorities could get here and cart the person away, right? I mean, we're talking about something really crazy. You know, to assassinate the head of state. That's what the ghost is asking Hamlet to do. Well, there's a whole political dimension to that too, isn't there? So there's very good reason for Hamlet to want some kind of evidence that would corroborate what the ghost has told him. And so what does he use as a test? The play within the play, as it's generally called. The play within the play. And that's the function of the play within the play. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. And so he tells the players, right? He tells the players, if I give you a few lines to add to your performance of the murder of Gonzago, you know, can you memorize them and put them in? Oh yeah, oh sure, we can do that. And so they actually act out a scene which is identical to what the ghost told Hamlet that Claudius had done to him, Hamlet Sr., in killing him. And of course Claudius reacts violently and clearly with a guilty conscience. And so Hamlet says, aha, aha.